Hello everyone, welcome to tonight's Open News meeting. My name is Lara Spirit. I am a reporter here at Tortoise. Tonight's session is going to be slightly different to usual. We're using these Open News meetings in part to focus on, as we usually do, the biggest stories as we see them, and to take a step back and consider what they mean, what we can do next, how we should be approaching our reporting here in the newsroom. We're going to be focusing on some of the things we've done this year, how those play into the current issues as they stand. And tonight, we'll be focusing on COVID, but more specifically on vaccines, because here at Tortoise, we've had something called the Arms Race campaign, which has been our campaign for global vaccine equity. And in light of the new Omicron variant, it seems particularly fitting tonight to be reflecting on what that means for the situation around global access to vaccines. And we've got a number of fantastic guests from around the world who will be joining us to share their thoughts on this question too. The first of these who I'm really keen to come to is Caroline Lucas, who many of you will know, who is an MP from the Green Party. And Caroline, I think is a fantastic person to start with, because actually, Caroline, I remember that you wrote an article for our campaign in July around global vaccine equity, and I had quite a depressing time today revisiting that article and thinking about, sadly, how little had actually changed. And I'm keen to speak to you because you've been in Parliament and you've been around the people who know what's going on about this. I watched Boris Johnson, as many of you will, on Saturday. A really terrible way to spend a Saturday evening. I watched him telling us about this new variant, telling us about what it means. And one of the first questions was from an ITV reporter who said, is the failure to share doses with the Global South in part responsible for this variant, which obviously firmly placed in the narrative, which we strongly believe here at Tortoise with, yes, it absolutely is. To which his response was, we're leading in vaccinating the world. In the UK, we've been part of the big AstraZeneca deal that's enabled many doses to reach the Global South, but we've also, sent millions of doses abroad, but we must do more. And actually, of course, we know the UK isn't leading in sending doses abroad. It's only sent a tenth of the 100 million doses that it's pledged, and that number stayed pretty still for quite a while now. He seems, even despite this question, to be getting relatively little pressure on this. I was wondering if you think, given this new variant and given the very compelling case that it is intimately linked to our failure as a global community to vaccinate the world, whether or not there's a sense in Parliament that there's going to be more pressure put on him in the coming weeks and months to do something about this crisis that he claims is both very important and he claims he's doing a lot about, but we unfortunately know that he hasn't quite stepped up in the way he's promised.
Well, thanks so much for the question, Lara, and congratulations to Tortoise for all that you've been doing on this issue. I really appreciate the fact that you've been just such a reliable commentator, really making sure this is on the agenda, because I think what's so shocking is that actually even in the chamber yesterday, when Sajid Javid, the health secretary, was outlining all the different measures that were going to be taken in the light of Omicron, there was probably only 2 or 3 of us who actually raised the issue of global vaccine equity. And I've been kind of puzzling in my head as to why that is, because as you've said, what we're seeing with Omicron is exactly what so many people predicted. In other words, that if you do have a situation where over half the world simply isn't getting vaccinated, then of course the chances of variants arising and mutating and coming here as well is going to increase. And so even if you didn't take a moral position, which frankly I think you should, but even if you didn't, then just from the point of view of trying to protect ourselves, it seems very odd to me that this hasn't been further addressed. So it is, I am surprised. I mean, there's been a little bit of focus on how much the government has delivered on its promises via COVAX. And in fact, it's even worse than you said, in a way, in the sense that actually the UK itself has been taking doses out of the COVAX facility, which is pretty horrifying. And then we had the news last week that 600,000 doses of vaccine had been thrown away because it had exceeded the sell-by date, because we hadn't got round to using it because we've got just so much stockpiled that we didn't really need it. I mean, this is grotesque and obscene. And there's been a little bit of coverage of that. But I don't know whether or not it's because people don't quite understand TRIPS waivers and there's lots of jargon, or what is it that means that there hasn't been the focus on what's happening at the World Trade Organization. Because I think the difference between relying on COVAX and the difference between having the right to manufacture vaccines yourself is the difference between charity and justice. And obviously, there'll be a lot of people out there, I would hope, who would say, actually, justice has to take priority here. And how can we possibly, as the UK, be blocking measures at the World Trade Organization which would allow this change of the rules? Even, we can accept it on a temporary basis if we have to, but why could we not have more of a majority saying, yes, those rules should change so that we do challenge the monopolies of big pharma, and so that we do enable countries in the global south to manufacture their own vaccines? It's quite extraordinary, particularly actually since the United States, who we quite often like to follow, the United States is finally on the right side of history now on this. So they are supporting, albeit a slightly more limited version of the waiver than India and South Africa had proposed, but nonetheless, the US is on the right side of history on this, and we are still not. So I just have to say, I find it obscene that a government like Britain's, which has one of the highest vaccination rates in the world, which is now offering a third dose to many of us, should be holding up this proposal when it's being demanded by the very countries who've been unable to vaccinate their own populations. We've heard world leaders say again and again that these COVID-19 medicines should be public goods, and let's not forget they were largely developed with public money, but then they refused point blank to take the action that would make that a reality. So instead of a people's vaccine, what we have is a profit vaccine. But just to end by just saying there are a couple of little rays of hope which we need to celebrate when we find them. And one is that I really welcome the fact that last week there was a submission of the patents and know-how of a new COVID diagnostic tool to the World Health Organization by Spain's National Research Council. And that seems to me to be a wonderful example of how we should be treating knowledge, particularly publicly paid for knowledge, in the middle of a pandemic. And I also welcome the establishment of a WHO-backed facility in South Africa to begin reverse engineering Moderna's vaccine in order that they can share this knowledge with the rest of the world. Basically, it feels to me that if the leaders of the rich countries won't live up to their rhetoric, then others will have to do the work themselves, and that is exactly what they're doing. So there are two small bits of chinks of light, but overall, as I say, I do find it really flummoxing that there isn't more of a debate about the enormous profits that these pharmaceutical companies are making. There was a really shocking article which I would commend in the Financial Times today on the profits that Pfizer has made. And all of these essentially have come back to public money going into research. And it does seem as if our government is more interested in propping up the profits of big pharma than actually ending this pandemic swiftly.
And do you think that I've been thinking about this a bit when we started this campaign, we thought quite sort of complexly, I think, about ideas around global social justice, these sort of like cosmopolitan ideas. How can we communicate that we have a right to others in the way that we have a right to those within our own bounded borders? And yet it seems, that argument aside, which, as you say, is compelling, we're looking at a situation where the G7 countries combined have 240 million doses that will go to waste by the end of the year. And you seem to think that you don't even need any of this philosophy to make the case, right? It should be so self-evident that these doses should be transferred to places in need. And yet these calls by people like Gordon Brown, for example, which have been, I think, well picked up in the media for an immediate airlift of these doses that are literally rotting in warehouses. It just doesn't necessarily seem to be cutting through, I mean, not necessarily massively in the public, but certainly not on the floor of the House of Commons. I just wonder, is there going to be any access points at all for campaigners or for people who care about these issues through the parliamentary process, you think, in the next few months? Because as it stands, you're saying, I'm going to be eligible for a third booster soon. I'm very grateful for that, but that will be before many healthcare workers on the front line in Africa, where just 7% are vaccinated. And you just think, surely the case has been made, it's so self-evident. How can we now think about influencing MPs? It seems like you are part of, unfortunately, quite a small group of MPs who are making this case kind of like loudly and forcefully in Parliament. And I think people like us just sort of wonder, well, what can we do?
Well, I mean, you're right to say that Gordon Brown has played a leadership role on this and has had a little bit of cut through, certainly, in media like the Guardian or the BBC. But in terms of actually shifting popular opinion more generally, it sounds awful that we need a another sort of Marcus Rashford figure, but we do need somebody who's going to champion this, because it's somehow we need to kind of break through the sort of wall of, I don't know if it's indifference or what it is, to mean that more MPs are getting more lobbying and more pressure from their constituents. And so one thing you certainly can do is yeah, please do lobby MPs and tell them this is something that you care about massively. And you know, as you've said, there is such a strong common sense argument for this, just from every angle that you look at it. You know, even if you were only caring about, you know, how soon does Britain get back to normal, which is kind of what a lot of the discourse is about, then we will certainly get back to normal in inverted commas, and we can discuss whether or not normal is exactly where we want to get back to. But our chances of doing that would be one hell of a lot greater if more people in the global south were vaccinated. I mean, it's just not rocket science. So I think somehow we need to get through to popular media. I think more pressure on MPs, and we know, of course, that this week there was meant to be a key meeting of the World Trade Organization, and it's been postponed, ironically, because of the Omicron variant. But when that World Trade Organization meeting does happen, which is when, you know, there will be decisions made potentially about whether or not to support this waiver, you know, if we get a date and we can really build a campaign running up to that date, so there's a particular moment when it can feel like there is a decision you can make, and you can make this day on this issue that will really change things, then maybe that will help to galvanize people in a way that a more general ask, when we don't have a particular, you know, obviously we want as soon as possible, but there isn't a particular date that we're all aiming for. Whereas if we could say, you know, at that meeting, you've got to decide it now.
But I mean, I agree, but I worry, because I feel like we've had these big moments, right? We had the G7 in Carbis Bay in June. We had Biden summit in September. We had the G20. We're going to have the 40% target at the end of the year, which we're going to miss. And you just wonder, you know, we have these big milestones that we can all come around and say this is such a conspicuous, glaring and indefensible failure of the international community. And yet, even when those come and go and there are a few headlines around them, there's not this sense of just collective shame that it feels like we ought to all be feeling. So I feel, I mean, I don't know whether or not you think the kind of international institutions that have been working in this area are more to blame than national governments. It feels like your blame is in a large part placed on the pharmaceutical companies that have developed this vaccine for profit, and the governments have allowed them to do that in a sense, and the kind of permissive relationship between them. But is there anything that people campaigning in this area you think can do to lobby international organizations, for example, or kind of international bodies more widely?
I mean, I think that's harder to do, to be very honest, in the sense that your leverage and your locus over an international organization is obviously less. I mean, by joining together with, you know, some fantastic campaigns like Global Justice Now and, you know, Stop AIDS and others who've been really active in this space, then definitely join those campaigns, and you know, by having those louder voices, then maybe that's a better way of getting your voices heard there. But let's not forget that the UK is really one of the villains on this. You know, there are a number of countries, Switzerland, another one, Norway, who have really been blocking this. And so given that it is our own government right now that is blocking it, and given that as British people we do have more of a direct link to changing their position, then it feels like if people have got limited time, then I would still suggest acting on our own government.
Okay, well, thank you so much. And I know you have to go now, but we're really grateful that you were with us and could share your thoughts. So thank you.
Thank you. And I don't disagree with what you said about, you know, we've had these international moments before and we failed them, and that's true. And I'm really sorry I can't stay with you, because I would love to hear other people's ideas about how we try to make sure we don't lose the next one. But it is hard to feel upbeat when you see something like this, where there is such a strong, obvious argument for working together, and it does make you think that, you know, when it comes to the climate crisis, you know, if we can't even get together on the COVID crisis, where there is a direct, immediate link to ourselves in terms of doing the right thing, then it does make one feel a little bit depressed about that too. I'll leave you on that happy note.
Thank you, Caroline. And I'd like to, if I can, bring in Branko Brick now, who's the editor-in-chief of the Daily Maverick, which is in South Africa. Hi. It would be fantastic to hear a bit from you about what it was like reporting on this issue last week, and what it was like watching the international stage report on this issue too.
Well, we hello from Cape Town. we have found out about probably a day before it was announced globally. And to be honest, the sense of dread, the same sense of dread we felt when Beta was a variant was announced from that it was found in South Africa. We knew basically what is going to happen next, and so we were not surprised, but we were fortunately outraged by the decision by the UK and the swift following by the rest of the world to close the Southern Africa, to travel, even if the Omicron variants were found everywhere in the world, in just about every country now. And just want to remind people that the woman that was in Belgium was diagnosed. She was nowhere near Southern Africa. She was in Egypt. So, let me tell you, the country was absolutely outraged. And South Africa is rarely united these days in anything, but the outrage was just by everybody. I promise you, the South African economy has been bruised and battered badly. We suffered in so many ways. We were in bad space before the pandemic, and then the pandemic came and literally devastated everything. We experienced industrial grade corruption in connection with PPE, especially in the local governmental health departments. And in July this year, we experienced the looting and insurrection in parts of South Africa, in KwaZulu-Natal and Gauteng. We barely managed to survive that. As a country, we barely managed to limp out of that crisis. And South Africa is really dependent on tourism. It's dependent on.
Sorry to interrupt you, but do you have a sense of what the economic damage will be from the travel ban that's been put in place? It
is. Let's put it this way: people who were not knocked out and destroyed by so far, they will probably be destroyed now. It's just as simple as that. I mean, big chunk of our tourism. Let's not even talk about parts of industry in economy that were not able to export anything during the lockdown times. And let me just remind you that we are in the longest lockdown in the history of the world. We are in lockdown since 15th of March last year. Just different phases of the lockdown, and it's very difficult to put it in numbers. Let me just give you an idea. The looting in July cost almost 400 lives officially, and almost $3 billion estimate. And South Africa is not a rich country. South Africa is actually a poor country of poor people and a few very, very rich people. And literally they were hoping for this season to tidy them over and help them survive. And
on the vaccination in South Africa, if I can ask you, our Prime Minister Boris Johnson on Saturday stood up, and when asked about the origin of the Omicron variant in South Africa, he said the problem in South Africa with the vaccination campaign is one of hesitation and not of supply, and cited this evidence, which others have cited, which is that South Africa had paused its vaccine deliveries because it had too many. But I'm wondering if you can speak a bit about the history of these vaccine deliveries in South Africa. It's been a very complex negotiation process with these companies, as I imagine, and one which has gone quite differently from other wealthy nations.
It is. Remember, we did not have a premium to pay for it, so we managed to slot it in. And some of our top scientists are very well plugged in international networks, and some of the leading virologists in the world. So literally through their private connections, we managed to get supply, and that supply is steady. And so far, right now, we actually in danger of some of our supplying being discarded because of the it just has not been used. We had the problems with this distribution of vaccines. That is sorted out right now. Quite a big problem that we have is people would call vaccine hesitancy. Some call basically anti-vaxxers. We have three major groups of people that are refusing to be vaccinated. One of them is rural people, and it's just the issue of I guess the fact that they traditionally do not believe anything that government comes up with. The second group would be in Afrikaans communities in small towns, because they're heavily influenced by the local clergy, and if the local clergy decides that it's not in the Bible, so you can't get vaccinated, which is true. I promise that's what they're telling them. And we somehow tried. Sorry.
I was going to say, it does seem like there are many of, I mean, I remember COVAX saying there are between 15 and 28 countries that have absorption capacity. And I remember a few months ago, we were saying this is going to be a real problem, is making sure that wealthy countries don't just give doses to these places, but are able to, as my colleague Zav is making in the chat, invest in ways to making sure that these doses are effectively delivered. And I saw a statement yesterday from CDC saying that it's not just that we need doses, we need them to be delivered in a timely manner. We need to have a schedule for their delivery, and we need to know when they're coming. And I think South Africa is one of the countries that has said that they're not getting them when they said they would, and they're not getting them far enough away from their expiry dates, which seems to be a real problem. And I'm going to come back to sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, it is, but anti-vaccine is becoming a serious problem in South Africa, and we literally did not have any queues in front of vaccination points until this week when Omicron arrived. It is just genuinely terrifying thought that we finally managed to get distribution and vaccines, and people are unwilling to get vaccinated, which boggles one's mind.
No, it is, and it's a very difficult framing question, I think, for people reporting on this, because obviously hesitancy is a big problem, but it shouldn't be this either or between supply and hesitancy. We should be able to have a adult conversation. We should, yeah. Exactly. I'm just wondering if I can come to a very good point in the chat before I move on to other guests from Jonathan Cake around the role of technology in this. Is Jonathan able to talk to us? Is a really important question about whether or not we're able to use big tech, or whether or not big tech should feel more responsible, which is something I think I've been wondering about a lot in terms of addressing this problem of global collectivism with vaccines. Hi, Jonathan.
Hey, hello.
Hi. Do you think you could expand a bit on that point in the chat? Because
sure. I'm just wondering about how on earth to have any kind of joined up thinking globally. And, COP has obviously shown us that governments are so mired in geopolitical interests and in nationalist interests that it makes it very, very difficult and very depressing as a sort of a way of confronting global issues. It just strikes me that this is a moment, this is a wildly incoherent and idealistic point, but it seems like a moment to me where the uneasy standoff between government and big tech could be bridged. We understand, particularly, of course, from Tortoise's brilliantly forensic reporting on it, that big tech are nation states unto themselves with intensely specific geopolitical interests. And one thing they do have in their unelected way is the ability to reach across borders. Now, obviously, Bill Gates has tried this COVAX initiative, which seems extremely mired in bureaucracy and difficulty, and maybe points the way that it's a phenomenally difficult thing to achieve. It strikes me that these platforms, though, are the way to reach and influence people. And it's a moment for big tech, or an influential figure within big tech, to decide whether they can influence want to go out of their way to influence a specific global concern. In this case, something we should be all able to get behind. Who
do you think would be best? Who would be your pick?
I'm sorry?
Who do you think would be best at that within the tech world? Who would be your pick?
Well, I mean, the awful thing is that all these tech moguls, almost without exception, are desperately in need of some positive, humanistic PR. So you could really take your pick from any one of this rogues gallery who might, want to be doing this for good or bad motives. I think Bezos would be a fine example, just simply because his reach is so enormous, and there is, as I said, there's always seemed to me to be an idealistic tendency within tech that has faded away as late stage capitalism exerts its icy hand. But I really feel like there is the historical moment to bridge that divide just before every big government starts to legislate on big tech itself. There's a moment of opportunity now.
Yeah, I think that's a really fascinating point, and I would quite like to get Joe Miller's thoughts on this, who's one of our guests tonight. He's the Frankfurt correspondent for the Financial Times and also the author of a book, Vaccine Inside Race to Conquer the COVID-19 Pandemic, which is specifically on the role of Pfizer-BioNTech in creating this vaccine, which I'm very keen to speak about because many people on this chat will have read the FT Big Read today about Pfizer, and Pfizer has been a company that we've reported quite a bit on in Tortoise. But Joe, who's an expert, I'm wondering if you could give us a bit of the backdrop to this Pfizer article today, a bit more of the context of Pfizer's journey, and it would also be really good to hear your thoughts on Jonathan's point just now around the role of big tech, especially with the way they interact with pharmaceutical companies, which seems to be a bit of an undercovered area, I think.
Yes, sure. On Jonathan's point, I'll get to that in a moment, because I think that sort of speaks more to the situation we're in now than to the development of the vaccine. And I come to this story from Germany, which is where I'm based, and BioNTech, which is the company that developed the vaccine and then tied up with Pfizer to essentially run clinical trials and commercialize it, is about 40 kilometers away. And I was lucky enough to sort of be inside BioNTech before that tie-up happened, and to kind of see the scramble in January and February 2020 close by. And as Caroline was speaking there, I thought that, you know, one of the interesting things that that resonated with me is that I share her moral outrage and you know, the Tortoise's arms race series mission, and of course, you know, I'm not a natural defender of big pharma, as I hope will become clear, but I think one thing that's been true from the beginning of this pandemic, when it came to first the development of vaccines and then the procurement and deployment, is quite simply, on a fundamental level, there was just not enough money on the table anywhere. When you look at what BioNTech was, a small startup in Mainz, had about 1,300 employees, 500 million in debt, your very traditional kind of biotech situation, a whole bunch of irons in the fire, none of them looking like they were going to come off anytime soon. And a boss who decided, Uwe Shahin, who decided to look at this pathogen, which was not yet called COVID-19, and decide to devote a significant chunk of the company's resources to developing a vaccine. It's okay, so far so good. As he was doing that, we had Bill Gates go on the Today Show with Trevor Noah and say that what he was going to do is identify 7 different vaccine developers, build greenfield sites, you know, ramp up production, have it all ready. And he said something like, we'll burn a couple of billion and it won't matter. Now, that didn't materialize. At the same time, you had discussions going on that started at Davos between CEPI and Gavi and Moderna, actually, at the time, about a globally coordinated response to the vaccine development and a global response, coordinated support. And that fell apart as soon as it hit political reality. And so we lost a few months on that side. We had bottlenecks on the second half of 2020 that were entirely avoidable. And as part of the research of this book, I saw letters that were going backwards and forwards to the Commission and to the Trump administration, and indeed to the UK government, that outlined already in March and in April exactly what developers were going to need, down to the vials and the stoppers and the needles and the syringes, etc. All of that was essentially ignored. Then when you get to the procurement, you had the US and the UK putting a obviously, you know, getting out there and putting some money on the table, but entirely selfishly for their own consumption. The global community, quote unquote, whatever that means, was almost entirely absent at that point as well. And now we're going through the same thing, which is we're looking at the problem in the global south, which Caroline eloquently highlighted. And I have my reservations about TRIPS waivers and things like that for various reasons. Again, not moral ones. I don't have any problem with that whatsoever. And I'm basically pro experimenting and seeing if it helps, because I don't see, why you wouldn't. But when you look at the numbers, and the FT piece today has some sort of big headline figures, 30 billion in revenues, etc. But then when you break down that figure and you think, okay, here's a company that probably saved millions of lives. And again, I'm not defending them, but this 30 billion isn't an awful lot of money. And I was speaking to a colleague in Indonesia the other day about the difficulties in vaccinating Indonesia, for example. We take Indonesia, it's got 280 million people. Let's assume they're all adults for the sake of a basic calculation. You could vaccinate the entire country for 10 billion. Now 10 billion is a rounding error when it comes to the cost of this pandemic, and it's certainly a rounding error when it comes to the cost of lockdowns for developed countries. And so I just see the simpler call as being, where is the money? How can we just put a pool together, put it on the table, procure these vaccines and get them to the global south as quickly as possible? And it's particularly egregious now because up until beginning of November, there were still some bottlenecks when it came to vaccine production. Now we're pretty much running at full steam. There is pretty much enough capacity to provide vaccines more or less to the adult population of the entire globe within the next few months. So quite why we're going to, going around the houses with TRIPS waivers and geopolitical wrangling and things like that, again, I don't have, any objection to that whatsoever. I just see all of the effort that's put into that and think to myself, as in an emergency, if we wanted to solve this tomorrow, we could do so incredibly cheaply. And we could deal with the sort of moral issues behind this, again, which I share the outrage, but we could deal with them once we've got people vaccinated and once we've perhaps managed to stem the flow of Omicron.
Reporting, I mean, reading the Financial Times article that you mentioned is quite staggering. The market share in Europe of something like 80% is just unbelievable. When you were reporting on this and telling the story from the beginning, was it obvious that they were going to be just as dominant as they have become? No,
absolutely not. No, I think that it wasn't clear really until some of the big players essentially dropped out, like GSK, or were significantly delayed. So I think even once that we had that big date in November the 8th, 2020, when we had that efficacy data, a few days later, Moderna came along. And the working assumption among Pfizer executives, for example, was that there would be 6 or 7, I mean, that's what their internal calculations assumed, there'd be 6 or 7 competitors by the time, we were where we are today. That didn't materialize, to their shock, as much as anyone else's. And I don't think it was ever sort of plan A to have the most dominant vaccine out there. On the contrary, I think there was some feeling that these initial deals that they made were the most important ones, because very, very soon, the market would be flooded. And, we saw, for example, CureVac here in Germany pull out of the race before they had some particularly not very encouraging data from one of their trials. But even before that, they pulled out of the race in the US, thinking there would be a glut of vaccine developers out there with successful vaccines. So it very much wasn't the case that Pfizer found themselves in this situation. I think that was entirely by chance and due to others dropping out. But that said, they certainly have done their best to make hay out of that situation.
It's interesting. It's a tale of both incredible human ingenuity, right, and just huge what you would consider failings to do the right thing and to help vaccinate the world. I'm interested particularly now in what you think about this new variant and its implications for new vaccines, and how you think, if they are going to be updating vaccines, whether you think they necessarily are, but if they do, how will the kind of race for dominance be different, similar to what's come before?
So it's interesting. I feel like I'm living, it's a terrible sense of deja vu. Sometimes I have to check when I read the paper whether we're still talking about the Delta or the new variant, because it seems exactly this time last year we were having exactly the same conversations. I think first and foremost, I've seen that the Moderna boss, for example, told the FT that he thinks that Omicron will damage the efficacy of his vaccine, and BioNTech's boss said he thinks it'll still offer some protection. I mean, first and foremost, I don't think we should be leaving any of this to pharma executives. I don't think we should be outsourcing public health advice to companies who have, can talk up their own book. We all have these vaccines now. We can test them ourselves. We should have public bodies who are testing them against new variants and coming out with very clear advice as to whether they work or not. And I think what's hugely damaging now is that we have this cacophony of voices. Is it effective? Is it not? At exactly the same time when we need to get people to take boosters. And I think the way this might be different than last time is we may just have a whole section of the population. And certainly from my vantage point here in Germany, that's exactly what's happening. That says, you told us 2 was going to be enough, and then you told us we needed 3, and now you're telling us that this third one might not even work against this new variant, and so we give up. And that to me is incredibly dangerous, and especially at the time when we're trying to get the global south firstly supplied and then vaccinated.
And do you think that there's any sense of kind of trepidation or shame among execs in Pfizer surrounding their behavior? I mean, you read in this article stuff around insisting on indemnity funding its funds, etc. In South Africa. I mean, just very timely that section on South Africa came out when it did. I just wonder if you think in this kind of like deja vu next stage again and again, whether or not you think there's any chance that a company like Pfizer will act any differently.
It was interesting reading that piece today in the FT and looking at those figures and looking at some of the comments below the line. People balking at the however many tens of billions it is in revenue. If you listen to an analyst call, a Pfizer analyst call, all you'll hear is investors asking why they are not booking more revenue from this vaccine and how you can help half the world and not or supply half the world, I should say, and not book more than sort of 30 billion in revenue. So I think that there are many executives at Pfizer who are under more pressure to raise prices and to somehow coin it in a significantly larger extent than they have been so far. And
do you think there's a sense in which they've done their job? 12 billion doses or so will have been produced by the end of the year. It's now up to the wealthy countries who have been stockpiling hundreds of millions to sort of redistribute them. Is there a way that we can sort of say, I know perhaps Caroline wouldn't agree with this, but we're not going to pick a fight with pharmaceutical companies like Pfizer to vaccinate the world. We can actually perhaps do it now without them, seeing as these wealthy countries who should agree with the argument of enlightened self-interest that sharing doses is for everybody's interest. Do you think we could just park the question of we hate Pfizer, we hate Moderna, and look to our leaders to just redistribute on our own? Why do you think it's still such a sort of delicious issue for people to pore over? I think, as you say, the kind of the interest in that article today, I think, just speaks to it perfectly.
Yeah, absolutely. You've hit the nail on the head. I mean, I think look at the score sheet of the people versus big pharma. When is the last time that the people won? It happens incredibly rarely. Pfizer has an army of lawyers. I've unfortunately had some interactions with them, and I can tell you that they really they're fully stocked. And when it comes with their war cabinet is fully stocked. We could have a protracted legal battle with big pharma, who in terms of image has nothing really to lose for the next 4 or 5 years, only to end up with some kind of settlement somewhere and an inadequate moral resolution as well. Or we could just say park the morals of it. What's the quickest way to get this stuff out there? And I say, I just cannot work out why the maths isn't being done on the back of an envelope. When you look, we just came off COP26. When you look at what the climate pledges are, the cost of the energy transition, the cost of vaccinating the entire world, 3 times is a tiny fraction of that. And if we can't get our act together to get that sort of thing done, I doubt we could do anything. I mean, it's quite depressing when you think about that.
Yeah, it's incredibly depressing. Well, thank you, and I hope we'll come back to you. I'd like now, if possible, Roger, can I bring you in? I think it's a good time to do that when we're talking about these kind of blindingly obvious statistics on why vaccinating the world is in absolutely everybody's interest, and yet seems to be completely outside of our grasp. Do you have any insights on, since the emergence of this variant, on how we should be thinking about planning differently in light of it?
Well, I'd agree with some of the comments from other speakers, particularly around what lessons this might provide around how governments approach other crises. So, for example, if you think about the examples just mentioned around climate change also needs to have a science-led response. It needs global cooperation, it needs new regulations, it needs a public-private response joined up to move fast. And it is quite sobering to think that you could basically end the pandemic very quickly if you focused the right resources in the right situations very rapidly. So I think governments can learn a lot from this, but the challenge is that in a world where there's many different complex systems interacting in unpredictable ways, that our political cycles are generally geared towards short-term responses that discount the real-world challenges of working in complex systems.
But do you not think in a way that, sorry to interrupt you, but that
go ahead, yep.
this compared to something like climate change is not a complex issue, you could argue, right? Like these are doses, 240 million by the end of the year, sitting in warehouses, I mean, over 1 billion spare by the end of the year, right? Sitting in warehouses that might otherwise not go to use and rot. Like how, when we're looking at solving climate change, can we not solve what is such a simple distributional question, right? I mean,
absolutely. And so your point's absolutely valid, because solving this current pandemic is ridiculously straightforward compared to the challenge that we have in combating global warming. 2 or 3 jabs or continued development of retrovirals, et cetera, will go a long way. And it's a relatively simple solution to what can be a complex problem, whereas climate change requires a whole number of different initiatives acting in unison with strong global cooperation, public-private partnership, and concentrated resources in a very focused way that go beyond political timeframes. The pandemic could be easily resolved within an election cycle.
And the Omicron variant, how does it change your calculation for the way that we think about the pandemic? How have the last few days kind of adapted the way that you think leaders should be dealing with this?
I don't think it's given us any surprises, to be honest. But one of the things that I think is fascinating is, if you consider that a variant may emerge which is more transmissible than Delta, but actually has very mild symptoms. So this would be like almost like the holy grail of COVID, where you had the ability to have super spreader events, which actually created a very mild disease, but boosted immunity around the world very, very quickly.
So to get, sorry, just so I'm thinking about this right, you're saying that Omicron, if it is true that it has less severe symptoms, right, that it could be a very, very good thing, and that we should kind of encourage people in some sense to get it even.
Well, one of the things that I help organizations do is start difficult conversations. And so
conversation.
Yeah, this is interesting. Also, conversations that are generally sort of outside the window of immediate possibility. So Omicron, there's not enough information around what it causes at the moment to be able to say for sure what the effect will be. But most of the coverage seems to be around a much more deadly variant for whatever reason. I think it would be really interesting to consider what would happen if you had a variant which, like I say, actually had milder disease as a result, but was much more transmissible. In effect, what you do is create the equivalent of chickenpox parties, where you create a level of global immunity very, very quickly by intentionally spreading a variant which has a very low impact on people's health, but is highly transmissible. That would move much faster potentially than any concerted global response to distribute excess vaccines.
Interesting. Well, I'm going to bring in my colleague Matt, if possible, to speak about this, because I think we've been throwing around variants with variants in the newsroom and are sort of pairing them off and see who will win. And I think we were reflecting earlier that, with all the carnage of Delta, perhaps a saving grace is that it stands firm against this new variant. Matt, what do you think?
Well, that's true. The irony is that Delta's sharp elbows may be the best defense against Omicron. I mean, my overall feeling is that I think we've reached the end of politeness in this particular struggle, if we're going to pursue it. In this sense that I think vaccine hoarding is the closest you can get to geopolitical murder, or at least negligent homicide, because we live in an age in which, an algorithm on a phone can deliver a book from Australia in 2 days, match you up your shopping. The supply questions involved in vaccine distribution are pitifully simple compared to some of the supply questions that are routinely done by coders every day. So there's no excuse on that front. Worse, there is a massive global surplus of doses now sitting in warehouses and other locations, expiring. And I find that combination not only morally intolerable, but intellectually contemptible. Yeah. Why has this happened? Well, partly because I think for people of my generation, it's been a very depressing spectacle to see how the sort of multilateralist system that began after the Second World War and was then rebooted after the end of the Cold War is now failing on almost every front. I mean, you only have to look at its failure in this respect, vaccine equality, its wretched failure in the evacuation and planning of evacuation after the fall of Kabul, and its pretty patchy performance at COP. And there are lots of reasons for that. One of them is tech, the disruptive power of tech. Another is that we are living in an age in which nativism and nationalism are now in dramatic revival. So, one of the most depressing moments of the last 2 years was when a cabinet minister told me that the cut of international development from 7% of GDP to 5% was not fiscally necessary, but politically appealing, on the basis that their focus groups told them that voters would like it. And, we now live in an age in which the asylum system is so broken that people go to human traffickers and die in dinghies, and lifeboat men are abused for pulling migrants out of the channel. These are very different times. And so precisely when we should be thinking globally, we are pulling up the psychic drawbridge and thinking nationally. And that's a very difficult thing to overcome. So the tools you use have to be appropriately galvanic, and the jolt you apply to the collective imagination of populations has to be stronger. And
how do we do that, Matt? How do we do that?
Well, you see, oddly enough, what
are we going to do?
I'm afraid one of my hopes for Omicron is everyone is saying, don't panic, don't panic, don't panic. I want Omicron to put the fear of God into people. I want Omicron to make people realize at minimum that this is a drill. This shows, this is a mutation, this is a variant with 50 mutations. Coronaviruses are not meant to mutate that much. So COVID-19 is really special. Delta only had 16 mutations. Omicron has 50, of which 32 are on the spike protein, which is the bit that actually links the virus to human cells. So it's really special. So the virus is while we've been talking and holding Zoom calls, Biden's been having meetings, Blinken's been having meetings, G20's been having summits, you name it. The virus has been busy doing the real work. And unless we do something quite quickly, another variant is going to come along, which will be even more dangerous. So, the best possible outcome from this particular squall, this particular impact moment, is that it turns out to be a teachable moment, and it finally gets through to people the message that unless other parts of the world are vaccinated, this pandemic will continue indefinitely, and the variants will continue to be unpredictably dangerous. Not all of them necessarily will, most of them won't be dangerous at all, but eventually one of them will. It's only a matter of time on the current basis that vaccine escape is achieved. So at the moment, we've set up a morons race between brilliant vaccine specialists who are completely unnecessarily having to constantly modify the vaccine to keep up with a variant process that should have been stopped already and could be stopped in a matter of months. I mean, your point was this is the right one. This is not like climate change. This is a very, very easy basketball shot. And I find it extraordinary that we haven't taken it already, but we haven't. And so the only positive thing that can come out of this particular episode, in my view, is that it acts as if you like, a bucket of ice cold water in the face of not just of world leaders, but of people. People finally make the connection. Now, again, I say that with no great confidence, but I really hope it does have that effect.
And do you think, we've been talking about this, but it feels a bit like the wind has sort of gone from Biden's sails. I remember we were saying in September, we had this moment of thinking, my God, he's going to call this summit and it's going to be truly a fantastic moment of global leadership, which will solve, as you say, a much simpler distribution crisis than the one that everybody at the time was focusing on, not wrongly, which was COP. And yet he sort of announced this 500 million Pfizer deal. Blinken seems to have been tremendously effective in coordinating places in the North of America. And yet it seems to have kind of fizzled out, or at least we haven't heard anything else around any sort of formal accountability mechanism. The data is hugely improved. And, we've done a data tracker, which I think our data team should be really proud of. But it seems that aside that, there's no formal mechanism really for holding the nations for account for warehouses rotting in doses rotting in warehouses.
No, absolutely. And I think that accountability element is a real issue. I think data is incredibly important, and you're right, the vaccine track has been one of the best things about the whole arms race campaign, but we shouldn't ever confuse data with communication. Communication is about feeling, and what has conspicuously not happened is that there has not been a growth of popular feeling around this issue at all. It's nowhere, nada, zip. And so until there is actually a sense out there that people fear the outcome of non-vaccination of the rest of the world, this will go nowhere. Because to your point about Biden is, we owe Biden a world historic debt for getting Trump out of office, and that stands and should always stand. But it's interesting how he too, in his own way, has proved to be a populist politician in that he says things rather than does them. And so he was at it again on Friday, saying, America is doing more than enough on vaccine sharing. Not the case at all. And to Caroline's point earlier, there is very little pushback. The media, and I hope Tortoise has sort of led the way in being the exception, but most of the media have shown absolutely zero interest in that. And I go back to one of the things that I remember very early on in this crisis, asking someone in the government, how does this compare with Live Aid and Band Aid and all that? And he said to me that the difference was that when Live Aid was happening, there wasn't famine in Guildford, which is a very crude and rough way of saying the problem we've got is that this is going on at home as well as abroad. And politicians of this generation do not have the sophistication to link up the two. I mean, actually, you might think it's an opportunity to say, guess what, it's happening everywhere. But in fact, because we live in such a nativist nationalist era, what happens is the debate is confined by borders, unlike the pathogen, which doesn't care a fig about borders. So, that Boris Johnson press conference you alluded to on Saturday, you would think that Britain was the only country on earth and Christmas was the only thing that mattered, there was one question about vaccine sharing, which in the context of the emergence of a variant of this power was mind-blowing.
Yeah, it's truly shocking. And like, I mean, remember we were talking about this earlier, but the Africa's vaccination rate at 7%, having received just over 7% of its contracted doses. I remember reading in The Economist a couple of weeks ago, they did that data report saying that, you know, if many of these nations, most of them in Africa, don't vaccinate in the next 6 months, then it's a question of sort of then or never in many senses. And that is, I mean, just shockingly tragic, I think. And it would be, so this 40% target that the global community has set, 40% of everyone should have had a dose by the end of the year. It looks like it's going to be missed in Africa in all but 2 countries. And I think Paul Caruana-Galizia, one of my colleagues, is here and can talk about a report I hope that he did earlier on in the year in Tunisia. Paul, are you there?
Hi.
Hi. It's interesting, I was reading that Morocco and Tunisia might be the only 2 places that actually do meet that target. So I wonder if there's something we can learn from Tunisia about how, in some way, sort of bridge what is a very terrible, you know, and cars, etc., and sort of in some way improve the vaccination rates in these countries. Is there a lesson from Tunisia, do you think, or perhaps not?
I mean, it's a really good question. So when I went in September, the vaccination rate was really low, below 10%. The country had one of the highest, if not the highest, death rates in the world. And the reason was largely down to the government failing to procure enough vaccines before the Delta variant arrived in the country. In part because dealing with COVAX was so slow because they didn't quite meet the low-income country requirement. In part because manufacturers failed to deliver. But I think the real story with Tunisia was how the COVID crisis, which was really a vaccine supply crisis, triggered what most Tunisians wouldn't call a coup, but what is on paper a coup, and is now run in a really autocratic way by President Kais Saied, who has done a lot more to distribute vaccines, secure bilateral supply agreements. So Tunisia's solution coming out of a really acute crisis was an autocratic one, which is maybe not something we'd want to replicate, but a measure of just how bad the crisis was, and that it also has political collateral and not just health costs.
Okay, interesting. So perhaps not necessarily any sort of admirably transferable lessons from that, I think. But I think it does inform the way that we should be thinking about reporting on this going into the next year. I'd like to ask Patricia as well, if you'll hear about that. We were thinking about this earlier, but so Patricia's from the data team here at Tortoise, who are responsible for a really brilliant tracker that we released earlier on in the year. What sort of coming to the end of this session, if we can speak at least a little optimistically, what are the kind of ways in which we can think about using data in the coming months to tackle this crisis, do you think? And how do you think Tortoise should go about thinking about it?
I think the sort of incredibly frustrating but sort of beautiful thing about COVID is that the data, we still have so much that we don't know, and the data is just constantly updating. The thing that I'm really interested in is, I mean, we still don't know really how the long-term impact of vaccines really is. Like, I wrote a piece a couple of months ago now on Pfizer's waning immunity, and with booster shots, for example, we still don't know whether actually it's a 3-dose regimen and a booster shot will mean that that's the last shot that's ever needed. Probably not. Or whether we're going to need a continued sort of vaccine regimen to keep people safe. And obviously, if that's the case, what are the global implications? How do we have to deal with rollouts? How do we deal with international supply? So I'm really interested in the data that comes out of these large surveys that look at sort of how the virus moves in public and within vaccinated and unvaccinated people, and what their long-term impact is. I think that's just absolutely essential. The other thing we can continue to do, I mean, I wasn't on the team that did the vaccine tracker, or I am on the team, but I wasn't on the main team that did that, but we can continue to hold government to account. The sort of, for people who aren't familiar with the tracker, the sort of main thing that it does is look at which countries are quote unquote stockpiling vaccines, how many have they bought, how many have they promised, and how many have they actually delivered to countries abroad. And I just think that that's a problem that's not going away. That's very clear from this conversation. And I think that we can continue to monitor that via our tracker and via new data that comes in as and when.
Cool. Thank you. I think that would be an incredibly important thing for us to do too, and hope that we can think about doing that in the new year. I'm noticing that we've just run over, so I think I'll bring this to a close, but very grateful to everyone who came tonight and who contributed. I really, really hope that even though it's almost inevitable that we'll miss the 40% target by the end of 2021 of vaccinating people, and looking back at kind of nearly 6 months of this campaign with ultimately very little changing in the global community to lead on this, I do really, really hope that going forward we can see some sort of reckoning on this issue, which is one of just, I mean, should be one of huge shame to global leaders, and also, as we've heard tonight, in some sense, pharmaceutical companies alike. But please do keep an eye on our arms race page. I'm sure we'll be updating it as we go along. And as ever, very grateful for any thoughts that you'd like to send any of us about anything that you heard tonight, especially any ideas that you think might help us in some small way contribute to finding a path out of this very tragic crisis. So thank you very much, and hope to see you all soon. Night.